Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and we're continuing our series of focusing on some local nonprofit organizations that are doing important work in New London. So my guests today are from the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust, Frida Berrigan and Clayton Potter, and we may be joined later by Charmaine Greger as well. She couldn't make it quite at this time, but she hopes to be able to stop in. Welcome, Frida and Clayton.
Thank you.
And I guess I look back, and the last time we did a show on the Community Land Trust was almost exactly 2 years ago.
Is that so?
Yeah, and then COVID happened, and we went off the air for a while. But I think it might be good to have a refresher of what is a community land trust and how does it work?
Well, I can take a first stab, and Clayton, you can correct anything I say wrong. But there are 333 community land trusts throughout the United States. And the basic model is that individual property owners own their homes or own nonprofits run programs on land or run community centers, but that the land is held by the nonprofit and really held by the people, held by the community, because Community Land Trust has a board that's made up of, 1/3 of the people are owner members, like Clayton, and Charmaine is also on the board in another capacity. 1/3 are community members who aren't owners, and another third are people with particular skills that are relevant, real estate people, lawyers, contractors, that sort of thing. But basically, the mission of the organization is permanently affordable home ownership opportunities, green space, and community space. And here in New London, when we kind of got ourselves together a couple years ago, housing wasn't affordable, and there was no community center. We were losing the Martin Center, and nonprofits throughout our city and community groups were constantly like, "Oh, I need to move offices. Where can I have a meeting? Where can we gather?" Because there's not a place in our community where it's easy for everybody to come together. Every community space, possible community space, has its own sort of culture or its own sort of set of rules or its own limitations, whether it's lots of stairs or no parking or anyway, so that we were kind of founded to fill all of those needs. And there were a couple key pieces of information that really motivated us. One was that here in New London, only 35% of us are homeowners, which is the inverse of healthy, economically healthy
and probably
communities.
The inverse of our state as a whole.
And the inverse of our state as a whole, right? That 60, 65, sometimes 70% of communities are homeowners and 35% are renters. But here we're backwards or upside down. And the fact that you can own a home, a family-sized living area, for less than what it costs to rent. Those two things really motivated us to get started and to help remove the barriers and the high thresholds that keep low and moderate income people in our community from seeing themselves as homeowners and moving in that direction. So we thought, well, let's take the I out of this and try and put in a we that would help kind of maybe not remove those completely, but make them kind of manageable steps instead of huge barriers.
Now, I know you were there kind of at the start when the research was still being conducted before it was formed as an organization. Clayton, your pathway into the land trust was a little bit different. Do you want to talk about it?
Sure. My path was very different, and it was sudden and just all fortunate in terms of timing. So I was making a Facebook post for work, and I came across the land trust page and a post that said, would you like to own a home? Do you think you can't afford to? And I checked both boxes. And shortly after, I reached out to Rain Doherty, who was the executive director at the time. And Rain invited me over to 34 Press Street, and I got to visit the home that that was the land trust first property, and soon after it became my first home. So it was all a matter of timing and a really great experience and partnership with the land trust. The first thing I did was become educated on what a land trust is and on the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust model. And as somebody who's really as a supporter of home ownership, affordable home ownership, I'm a New London native, so buying a home in New London is something I've always wanted to do. This seemed like the best way to do so, particularly because of the permanently affordable aspect that Frida mentioned.
And I do have some slides, and maybe since we're talking about some of this stuff, we can show just some of the introductory slides about the Community Land Trust. And so this is the mission. And as Frida mentioned, it's one of its purposes is stewardship to create permanently affordable housing, but also land for food production, green space, and facilities for community organizations, which I know there are other land trusts in the country that focus on all of the above, but not all of them do. Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned a little bit why the community organizations part was part of it, but green space and food production, was there a specific reason why our land trust here thought that was important?
Yeah, well, as you know, we are a small community. We're 6 square miles. We're very clearly bounded, and so one of the key organizations in the formation of the land trust was Fresh New London, and I only I was on staff at Fresh for 4 years, involved in the organization probably for about 7. And in the course of my involvement in the organization, I think they had 6 different offices. And our main growing space was city land at the intersection of Mercer and Williams as part of the Martin Center campus there. But when we learned just by chance that the building was up for sale, that the city was looking to divest itself of this property and all of the land that was a part of it, and we said, well, that's our garden. What do we do about that? How are we going to move? Where do we go? And we looked at buying property, and actually that was some of the early work before we had even incorporated as the land trust. Exploring a couple different properties that were for sale and the process that we would have to go through as a small nonprofit that's fiscally sponsored by an organization outside of New London. Anyway, just thinking about permanently accessible land for a community gardening organization, recognizing that community gardens raise property values, that they increase community cohesion, that they and that they're often exploited for gentrification. And so land that was marginal and neglected and not cared for becomes a community garden. All the people come together to do the work, and then they lose that value because real estate developers come in and all of a sudden say, oh, this community needs a yoga studio and some live-work lofts. And so we thought, well, if we own our own land, then the community can keep all that benefit, and we won't be in danger of being knocked off. And so Fresh's participation kind of came out of that concern about maintaining green space, continuing green space to be accessible to community members, not like a wedge that is followed by latte drinking gentrifiers, but then also that just the negative impact of nonprofit organizations, and Fresh is one example of this, but pretty much every organization with an office that I know about in New London suffers these like moves that are they take so much staff time. You lose contact with your community members because you're moving, and just the logistics of it are so hard. And you lose something every time you move, right? And that's true for individuals, that's true for families, and that's true for community groups.
So the first project that the Community Land Trust took on, and I think this was something else that kind of dropped in the Land Trust lap, was a lot on Ledyard Street, just north of Vauxhall, which looked like this.
Yeah.
And so you really started with the food thing. So we can kind of scroll through.
So this is the before.
Yeah.
And this is the middle, and this is the Google Street View that I got today.
Yes.
So it has been transformed, and this is a lot that was given to the Land Trust and has a community garden on it now with, as you could see from the middle pictures, a lot of neighborhood involvement in its creation.
Yep. There are 16 community garden plots, and then there's snack beds, and then there is a burgeoning food forest. Black currants, red currants, elderberry, a number of other edibles and medicinals that are planted there. There's rain catchment and a greenhouse, and it is a very small lot. I think it's 0.076 acres, so it's not a buildable lot. But a lot can happen in a small space, and this community garden demonstrates that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, not a buildable lot when you consider what the required setbacks are from the boundaries. I think I looked at it, and maybe a tiny house could go on it, but a standard size home, even a small one, really can't.
But it's good to see that this is the potential of community partnerships with the Land Trust. The Land Trust is partnering with Fresh, a food justice organization, and this space, I'm 25 years old, that space was empty the entirety of my life because it's not a buildable lot. But that doesn't mean that there can't be plenty of good things that happen there. And this is not only is it serving the community, it's very productive. It contributes to people's, like the snack beds, for instance, Frida mentioned, are accessible to all community members to walk by and grab a bite to eat. This site is another site that it contributes to the harvest for Fresh's community supported agriculture program, which I benefit from, so we have to rethink about our spaces, and I think that's what the Community Land Trust does a great job at. It's not just homes, but stewardship of green space and community space.
And I think communicating that is really important because the last update of the city's plan of conservation and development, which I think was approved in 2017, did for the first time contain, with Fresh's support, a section in support of urban agriculture. And one of the goals was to use land that, for whatever reasons, cannot be used for more conventional development for food production. And that includes things that are in wetland areas too, where you can have agriculture, but you can't do any kind of permanent building. So on to the second project, and this is the one that Clayton has become the expert in, 34 Press Street. So what was your experience after you clicked those two boxes and ended up a homeowner?
Right, so I got to first come in and tour the home, and it is 152 years old at this point. It's a stone home. We believe it was built by George Prest on Press Street with tiered backyards that actually run the length of the street, and it seems like he was a farmer. So I was immediately enthralled, and there's wood all over the place, so I've always been attracted to homes like that. And a big, beautiful window that's letting in the majority of the light in that photo of the kitchen. So I was excited that I liked the home. I was excited that it was on Press Street, just 3 blocks away from my family home where I grew up. And I met with Rain, the executive director at the time, and one of the first things, as I mentioned earlier, is being educated on the land trust. And I watched the Helping Hands video. And then I read a little bit more about the SECT land trust. And like I mentioned earlier, once I understood the mission of the land trust and the motto that allows the home and the land to remain, you could say in the hands of the land trust, but also in the community. You know, the land trust is no single person. It's a tripartite board which includes community members, includes homeowners, and I was in full support of that. As a person who's been involved in nonprofits since I was 15, I recognize the difficulty in buying and owning your home in New London, and I'm also personally interested in owning property for different reasons. I would like to own land one day, but also property for income streams. And 34 Press Street is actually a 2-family home. So that fact is what made it affordable for me as a low-income person to be able to, go through the long closing process, receiving my loans from my mortgage lender, and then being able to move in and also have a new stream of income. And again, with the land trust, it's the apartment doesn't pay the mortgage, but that's okay with me. It provides a space for my tenants to live affordably, and it allows me to live affordably. And I know that whenever I leave, or if I keep this home within my family, it will continue to do the same. It's not about getting rich. It's not about exploiting people. It's not about development and gentrification. Mm-hmm. It's a way that shows that this is an option for all people, even low-income people. We can find a way, and the land trust and these models, I think, just bring this option closer to the people and make it more realistic and more feasible.
And the block you're on, the first time I saw that video that was put out about the various community land trusts, I was struck and I did not grow up in New London. I grew up in Philadelphia, but there are Philadelphia neighborhoods that follow the same kind of pattern that were working class family neighborhoods back before World War II. And then after, white flight and the development of the suburbs and the incentives for people to move to the suburbs, that the people new young families were not moving into those neighborhoods anymore. So when the older generation that had been there since the 40s started to die off, the neighborhood was taken over often by absentee landlords or really neglected. And that particular neighborhood in New London looks to me like one that was a real family neighborhood 40 years ago. And then it lost it, and hopefully the Community Land Trust will bring it back. I know a friend, Derek Strong, who grew up on Press Street, across the street down the street from where you are, but I don't think there's much home ownership on the block now as there was
There's zero.
30 years ago when he was a kid.
That's right. So I would say it's still a family neighborhood. There's families in every home, as far as I can tell, but right, there's
But they're not
no
owners.
homeowners. Right. I know I own 34 Press Street, and I believe my neighbors own their home. They've been there for a long time. But I'm not sure of that even. So, right, it's unfortunate, but that's why I'm proud to own the home. That's why I was like, okay, Press Street, I'll take it. There's some people have reservations for whatever reasons about, the neighborhood, but that was more compelling for me because, what are we going to do? Leave it to developers?
Yeah, and what you said about having the apartment, that's a very current discussion now because at the state level in the last legislative session, I think Desegregate Connecticut had pushed legislation to allow ADUs, accessory dwelling units, by right in single-family zones. And I live near the hospital, and it is a single-family zone, but it's an old neighborhood from a 100-year-old neighborhood. So about a quarter of the houses on my block are, two-family houses that were grandfathered in. And I see it is like a wonderful thing to be able to have another dwelling unit. On my block, it's very often been multiple generations of the same family being able to, live in the same home. The elderly relative on the, first floor, and then the the growing family on the second and third floors. But I know that people who live on the other end of town in, near Ocean Beach have a very different perception of, accessory dwelling units and feel very threatened by it. So I'm really always happy to hear people who have a positive experience with having a two-family home in a family neighborhood. Let's see, what else?
I also think it's, on that note, so many of these homes in family neighborhoods on the side of town north of Willits Avenue are multifamily homes.
They are.
But they're not owned by the people who live there.
Right.
And I think that creates several gaps. There's the owner who doesn't live in town, isn't as ironically invested in some ways in their property.
Right, literally,
Right.
and not so literally.
Right,
as well.
exactly, yep. And then literally and not so literally, the renters aren't invested in maintaining the home or keeping the property in a certain way, or the outside, sweeping up the sidewalk. That's not necessarily their responsibility as renters. So it is, there's different perceptions even within the people who are in the homes. So how can we change how we relate to where we live?
Right.
Right, and you can follow that all the way through. Like you look at a city as small as New London, right, 27, 28,000 people. who votes in town, who attends city council meetings, who serves on boards and committees. It tends to be homeowners, and so their interests, their views, their values are sort of overrepresented, are more, are just kind of like taken to be like the voice of our community when they're not, and then occasionally an issue will come up where I guess like the pay to throw was a good example of that, where there's a real clash. But I whenever I think about switching if the ultimate goal of the community land trust is to switch the ratio, right, and to kind of switch from 35% home ownership to 65, for example, to imagine how that will change, how our community is, like the voice of our community, the dominant voice within our community, being different as a result of that change, right? Because, not that homeowners have so much more time than renters, but one of the principles of the community land trust is that our owners should not be cost burdened, right? Which means that we don't want people to spend more than a third of their income on their living situation. And so, that just provides like some flexibility, some resiliency for job loss or illness or changing circumstances within the household. Aren't immediately, your first thought isn't like, how do I pay my mortgage or how do I pay my rent, because it's a third, not half or 2/3, right? And many renters in New London are right up on the line, right? And so are lots of homeowners, which is, kind of a whole other sort of situation of people sort of feeling like they deserve or can borrow more than they really, can ever repay, right? And that's a culture-wide sort of problem within the United States. But to have people who only need to pay a third of their, monthly income or annual income for housing means people have more time, right? People can be community gardeners. People can be, attending to the needs of their neighbors. People can be serving in some sort of, in some sort of community capacity on a board or a commission or a committee. Most of our, you look at the flow chart of the City of New London, and there's spaces on all these boards and commissions, and and not enough people with enough time to do all of that.
And the participation on the commissions is often not very diverse. That isn't always the case, but I'm on the Planning and Zoning Commission, and we are predominantly white people who live south of Willits Avenue, and it isn't that people are evil if they live on different sides of town, but their perspectives, just as what I've heard from how people view this accessory dwelling unit issue, whether people think, my elderly aunt would be able to move into an apartment if I had it, or my friend would be able to move into an apartment if I had it, and they're more afraid of someone's going to have an Airbnb and there will be parties every weekend on the summer that are going to disturb my peace and quiet. So it's just maybe a different lived experience, and you don't really see how the others perceive it or will experience it. So let's talk a little bit just about the organization of the Community Land Trust. You mentioned the tripartite board. Are you looking for board members, or at this time, maybe not, but probably members who may at some point want to become more involved?
Right now, we have one opening on the board, which is for a farmland representative. So that's that's a opening that would have to be, you'd be invited to.
Probably not one of the New London members.
No, no. So we're not currently looking for board members, but we are looking for members, and we're looking for active participants, particularly in the New London chapter. And we have monthly meetings on Zoom, and our next meeting is the second Thursday in January, which I want to say is January 14th at 6 o'clock.
Now, if a person wants to get on the mailing list to find out about those Zoom meetings, how would they go about it?
They could email info@sectclt.org, info at Southeastern Connecticut CommunityLandTrust.org, or they could email me, frida.berrigan@gmail.com.
Okay, so there isn't like a separate website or Facebook page for the New London chapter at this time?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess my next question is, what specific kinds of things does the New London chapter do that is a little bit more localized in its focus than the whole Southeastern Connecticut Land Trust?
Well, right now, as we've mentioned, we own 2 properties in New London, and we have, which we didn't say, right of first refusal on a number of other different projects around New London that we've contributed to or facilitated in some way. But we are actively looking for new properties. We're concentrating on properties that are currently vacant. We don't want to displace anybody or cause anybody anxiety. We don't want to buy a property that's full of people and kind of have to navigate all of that. We are looking for properties. We have American Rescue Plan Act funds that are available to us in a partnership with the City of New London to acquire properties. We're concentrating roughly kind of between Clayton's house and the Community Land Trust green space on Ledyard Street. That's roughly kind of our span. And then up to Coleman and, down to Huntington, kind of Truman J, is the area of New London that we are chiefly interested in to kind of, develop some critical mass. So right now there are a number of vacant properties that aren't on the market that we're trying to relate to the owners. It's a little bit of a tricky process because many of those vacant properties are owned by trusts or owned by banks, or there's a lot of layers to get to them. And our intention is to renovate them, acquire them, renovate them, and then offer them for sale, much in the way 34 Press Street was offered for sale. In order to be eligible to buy a Community Land Trust property, one has to be a member of the Community Land Trust. They need to have attended at least a couple meetings and have watched Homes in Hands, this sort of primer on community land trusts, and be income qualified, right? With been sort of moderate income, at that level. And then we would work with that individual, that family, to purchase a property. So that's like kind of the main thing that we're working on right now, is looking for property. So we come to our meetings and we're sort of talking about, should we buy a single family? Should we concentrate on some level we just want a second project, a new project, but if we have the opportunity to choose, we would choose a 2-family to kind of have the same benefit that Clayton mentioned, where you provide a good place to live for a low to moderate income family, and then the homeowner has a revenue stream and a cushion towards their mortgage and towards their own living expenses and for future improvements on the home. So a 2-family, should we have a 2-family? Should we try and buy a apartment building, and should the land trust be landlords, or should we have a limited equity co-op? We have all these kind of ideas. Should we buy a commercial property? And so these are sort of the questions that we're asking.
I'm guessing that the demand for office space has not gone away.
It hasn't gone away. I mean, the pandemic certainly changed the way, many
True.
people work. And so the idea of everybody, kind of going back into an office and sitting next to each other and working at computers.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. And, I think there's a reckoning coming on, the whole nature of work in a way, and where work happens and how one, and how organizations ensure that their workers are healthy and happy and maintaining balance, all that stuff. So, but so there's a lot out there, right? And I think the New London chapter is critically aware of the coming, right? There's a current housing crisis, and then there's a coming housing crisis because the eviction moratorium. And the sort of short-term benefits that so many have enjoyed, whether it's not having to pay their student debts or abatement of debt, all of that will end at some point. And then and then the piper must be paid, and I think there'll be a lot of work to do in that regard. So
a lot of people in crisis.
A lot of people
all
in
of a
crisis.
sudden.
And locally, people did such a great job taking care of each other, and Step Up New London and other organizations raising money to pay landlords, and all of that was very stopgap, and it's not. It's not systemic change. It wasn't trying to be. It was trying to just meet people's immediate needs, and it's so important. And yet, there's people aren't living in great living situations. They're not healthy living situations. And so, how do we get from where we are right now to where we want to go? Is the big question before many of us, and the Community Land Trust is doing our little part of it.
I know when Press Street was renovated, there were city funds for things like lead and asbestos related and abatement and to bring things up to code. Are those funds also, do they remain available for any kind of new renovation?
Yeah, and anybody can access, New London homeowners can access them, and really should. Those programs all got a fresh infusion of money from the American Rescue Plan Act. And I think Judy Cox administers the lead abatement, and Tom Bombria administers the code kind of projects. And for homeowners, you can get up to $20,000-$30,000 towards all of these renovations. And then the city hires a contractor and kind of inspects all of the work, and it really is a good program.
Right. And I've even been able to take advantage of one of the programs since becoming the official homeowner of their property. When my furnace went out last March, I was able to. That was an expense I couldn't afford out of pocket, and I was able to reach out to the city and take advantage of one of these programs, and they were able to help me through the situation when I absolutely needed it. So,
is that one of? I know some of those programs, like 1/10 of a loan of the loan gets forgiven every year, so that you're in your house.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually on my particular loan, there's no interest rate, and I believe there's a forgiveness after a certain amount of years. I won't say it because I'm not entirely sure, but
whether it's 5 or 10.
I think it is 10-year forgiveness, but it's also an affordable loan compared to anything that I would have had to pay for going immediately through the contractors.
Mm-hmm.
So
and it's great that they go through the work of screening and choosing the contractors.
Yep.
That's right.
Another kind of idea that we've been talking about within the local, and actually this was a little bit of a brainstorm of Felix Reyes in the Office of Economic Development. He said, there are elderly homeowners in London whose houses are really having a hard time, and we, those homeowners when they pass, often the house is really far gone, and it ends up kind of owing more than it is worth, and these are the houses that end up being sort of vacant and derelict. And he said, what would it look like if the land trust was kind of working with these older homeowners, most of whom are also just individuals, perhaps it was a family home and the family's moved away, and nobody else is living in it. It's, could the land trust work with the homeowner to make the needed renovations, maybe even put in an apartment, a legal apartment, an accessory dwelling unit, and make it a healthy place and a safe place for the elder to, live out their remaining years. They could benefit from the income of a tenant, and then, by some mechanism that was agreed to, when this whole kind of plan came into place, the property would transfer to the land trust, when the elder passed away. And this is like Felix's brainchild, and something that land trusts, well-established land trusts in other communities do, right? This is kind of one way that land trusts acquire properties, is by stabilizing troubled properties owned by typically by elder individuals. And so that's something we're seeking to learn more about, and then do a pilot project here in New London, see if it works, see what we learn from that, and move forward. And there's definitely some tricky components to it, and things we need to be very thoughtful and very clear about, and connecting with the family as well as the homeowner. Anyway, there's a lot kind of to put together, but it was an exciting idea, and it was kind of people within the city really kind of having a land trust lens on the very deeply entrenched problems around properties here in our community. And I live on Connecticut Avenue at Cedar Grove, and can think of half a dozen, homes, between, walking from my house to the community garden at McDonald Street, right near Clayton's house. I can think of half a dozen houses that, theoretically could really, benefit from a project like this, a program like this.
It's not in your catchment area, but on my block, actually, there are homes that would have really benefited from this. That it didn't happen, but there are problems that could have been headed off if we, especially if the heirs don't really want the property.
Right.
It's tough. Mm-hmm. So, if people go to your website, there are a couple of slideshows there, and I'm not going to show them, but if anyone who goes to the website, just sectclt.org, can see a couple of slideshows that were put together by Conn College interns a couple years ago, I think now, and about home ownership, about wealth gaps, income gaps, segregation. And I took a couple of slides from one of them, and it isn't really the focus of the land trust. I mean, I feel as though the community land trust works as best as it can within the current zoning laws and isn't really lobbying to change the zoning laws, especially in the old neighborhoods that you're operating in. So many of the structures predate zoning anyway that it's almost a moot point. But there were some interesting stats about New London and the wealth gaps, income gaps, and segregation within New London County. So I just grabbed a couple of these slides. The demographics, the darkest brick color is a white population, and Hispanic, Asian, and of course New London is the most diverse by far, from among New London County. Something about the difference between a wealth gap and an income gap, both of which New Londoners suffer from, but owning a home, even though people can't get like windfall profits off of a land trust house the way they might if they bought from like Habitat for Humanity, and 15 years later they could sell it at market rate and really get a windfall, even though a lot of donated work and materials went into it. It's still building equity, which is, which does contribute to wealth. And once again, the statistics that Annika had come across just said that New London is 30% owner occupied, which is really low. And but 13% vacant, which I see is, well, that could be an opportunity.
That is definitely an opportunity, and it's hard to parse out, what 13% vacancy rate means, in the sense of like what's vacant and derelict, what's just kind of standing empty. Does the Crystal Ave apartments, are they
part of that?
Are they part of that number that's 100 or so living units, right, that are empty for sure, but they're no longer, they can't be inhabited.
Right.
And when you ask the city, could I please have a list of the vacant properties in New London, they don't maintain a list of that. They don't maintain a list of derelict properties or blighted properties. They don't maintain a list of landlords and complaints against landlords and criminally negligent landlords. There's the data collection at our city level is very, very anecdotal, and it's not empirical at all. And so we're really kind of creating the information as we go along, and which is kind of part of our coming into our own, part of our kind of identifying as the community land trust, really part of our deep learning as an organization. And but it would be kind of so much easier if we could just work from a list. I
sure would, because when you look at the new construction that's happened in New London over the last 5 to 10 years, most of it is more rental units.
That's right.
Certainly fewer, more than 70% are rental units. Maybe 5% is owner occupied, either single family houses or on some odd little lots, but mostly the new construction has been rental. It hasn't really helped our owner occupancy rate at all, but it seems as though restoring, rehabbing some, whatever appropriate vacant buildings there are could be something that could really build the ownership rate. I have no idea what other slides I put here. Oh, yeah, this is a little just hard to see, but basically the darker the green, the more home ownership there is. And New London, which is very, very pale in the north end and kind of pale in the south end, has a very poor ownership rate. I'm thinking that some of the ownership rates on the east of the river, on the Groton side, might really be open space and not really
Right.
residential.
That's right.
At
I think
all.
That's true. Yeah.
Why is this something? Oh, I think I don't know what I did here. Oh, there.
Ah.
Okay, the city, so this talks about the wealth gap, less homeowners, and is more diverse than the county. And I'm just put this in because the fact that you were talking about, the payments being less, no more than a third of a family's income, is somewhat pertinent here. And once again, there's an income gap. And, well, the question here was, why is New London County segregated? And I think in the slideshow, in the presentation, zoning was laid a lot of the blame for it, the single-family zones. In New London, some parts of New London, but also in surrounding areas where you need half an acre to build a single-family home. But what I found was the CLT core values, that many of them do kind of address pieces of why things are so segregated and why there isn't more wealth and more ownership and more information. So I'm finished with the slideshow. You can take that. I've been told we have 4 minutes left. So I guess the last thing I'll ask is, so how can people get involved or otherwise help the efforts of the Land Trust?
Sure. Well, you can come to a community land trust meeting. As I said, the New London chapter meets every month. We tend to meet on Thursdays. We tend to try and schedule them around planning and zoning meetings, but we don't often succeed in that. There's so many planning and zoning meetings. But we're doing our meetings on Zoom. We have tried to have them in person through the summer, but if you want to find out when the next meeting is, please email me, frida.berrigan@gmail.com. And you can also find out through the CLT website, info, sectclt.org. If you see vacant, derelict properties in your neighborhood, if you happen to own properties that you no longer want, and want to the tax benefit and the good feeling of knowing that your property can be renovated into a home ownership opportunity for New Londoners, that would be a great thing. We always need money, so you can donate money. But really, just kind of getting involved, coming to a meeting would be huge.
And I'm guessing that the website has information that people can just become a member as well.
Right, become members. Yep.
Well, thank you, Clayton, and thank you, Frida, for the update. Good luck in your quest. Congratulations on getting American Recovery Funds, because I can't really think of a better use for them in the city. And for all the rest of you, we will be continuing, I'm not sure with whom, but throughout the spring, focusing on nonprofits in the area. So we'll see you, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rana.
Yeah.